Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
It is great to be here.
So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are running the most profitable, the most efficient department in your entire company.
Okay.
You generate the bulk of the revenue. But one day, management pulls you aside and says, well, because you are so efficient, your department doesn't actually need as many people anymore.
Right.
And because voting power on the company board is based, strictly on headcount, you are about to lose your voting rights to a department that actually loses money.
That is a harsh scenario.
It really is. I mean, how would you react? Would you just stay quiet, or would you threaten to quit? Today, we are looking at how this exact scenario is threatening to fracture India. And, that is just one piece of a massive puzzle we are putting together in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We are diving into a huge stack of 7 articles today, spanning the editorial, ground zero, spotlight, and weekend sections. Our core mission here is to examine a very modern friction. Basically, the growing gap between grand national narratives like headline GDP or massive beautification projects and the complex, often really messy realities happening right under our noses.
And it's a phenomenal tension to explore. We so often see planning and governance happening from this 30,000-foot view.
Right, like looking at a map.
Exactly. But you and I and everyone listening, we live our lives at ground zero. And when the official map sitting on a bureaucrat's desk doesn't match the actual territory we walk on every day, well, the system starts to buckle.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that, starting with what might be the biggest structural fracture of all from our first editorial. We are looking at the widening socioeconomic gap between India's peninsular south and what economist Riverfront refers to as the Great Indian Plain.
Yes, essentially the highly populous Hindi heartland.
Right. And as we're just reporting from the source material, the contrast is becoming, well, impossible to ignore.
It really is. We are watching 2 totally distinct economic realities trying to share one sovereign space. If you look at the southern states, they have roughly double the per capita income of their northern counterparts.
That is wild.
It's massive.
Okay.
Places like Tamil Nadu and Kerala are boasting human development indicators, things like life expectancy, literacy rates, that genuinely rival upper middle income countries in Europe. Meanwhile, the incredibly populous heartland is grappling with development challenges that look, frankly, more like sub-Saharan Africa.
And, if it were just an economic quirk, maybe we could sort of ignore it. But we are fast approaching the next national census and the delimitation exercise that follows it.
Right, the redrawing of the boundaries.
Exactly. Just as a quick refresher for anyone listening, delimitation is the redrawing of parliamentary constituencies based on population. The more people a state has, well, the more political representation it gets in parliament.
And this creates an absolute existential crisis for federalism. In a highly functional federal system, the regions generating the wealth and the regions holding the political power, they usually have some alignment.
Yeah, some sort of balance.
But here, if we distribute parliamentary seats purely by headcount, the prosperous South is staring down a dramatic reduction in its political voice. It is the classic dilemma of a highly productive minority generating the wealth that ends up subsidizing a massive politically dominant majority.
That brings us right back to that corporate analogy I mentioned at the top.
Right, exactly. If you look at history, the USSR and Yugoslavia are among the only major states that walked the specific path, and, well, it famously tore them apart.
Wow. So if you are a citizen in the South generating this wealth, what happens when you start feeling like an extractive colony? Because, that is the actual phrase used in the editorial.
A rupture becomes highly probable. Now, policy experts are scrambling for solutions. The article mentions Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who has proposed a concept called digressive proportionality.
Okay. Digressive proportionality. That sounds like something out of, an advanced calculus textbook.
It is a bit jargon-heavy, yeah.
Break that down for us. What does that actually look like in practice?
Simply put, it is a mathematical compromise to balance population size with state equality. You give the larger states more seats overall, but fewer seats per capita.
Ah, okay.
Right. And conversely, smaller states get fewer seats overall, but more representation per person. It's a way to ensure that sheer demographics don't result in total political domination. It keeps the federal scale somewhat balanced.
But the editorial is also quick to point out that the South cannot just point the finger northward and claim the moral high ground here.
Oh, absolutely not.
Because the South has a massive internal crisis of its own. They are currently caught in a socioeconomic middle-income trap,
They absolutely are. The headline, Wealth of the South is masking some incredibly deep inequality. The economy there is still heavily extractive. Take Tamil Nadu, for example. The per capita income is triple that of Bihar, but if you look at the daily agricultural wage, it isn't even double.
Which tells us what, exactly?
That tells us the massive wealth generated by the tech and manufacturing boom is being captured by a very, very narrow elite.
Right. And the editorial highlights that wealth in states like Karnataka and Telangana is highly concentrated in just like 3 or 4 urban districts. So beyond the national political fight, what is the domestic fallout for the South?
The fallout is social stagnation. Unless these southern states address their own deeply ingrained casteism, their heavily skewed wage structures, and their inability to turn raw capital into broad social transformation, they will hit a wall.
So it's an internal fix just as much as an external one.
Exactly. The grand bargain for national unity isn't just a treaty signed between New Delhi and the state capitals. It requires a renewed social contract within the borders of the states themselves.
So, moving to our second editorial. When you realize that massive regional prosperity can completely obscure deep local inequality, it naturally makes you wonder about the national picture.
Yes, the macro data.
Right. Is the entire country's headline economic growth narrative also masking reality?
A major new study by economists Abhishek Anand, Josh Fellman, and Arvind Subramanian suggests exactly that.
Their findings are pretty staggering.
Very. They have presented compelling evidence that India's post-2011 GDP growth may have been overstated by anywhere from 1.5 to 2 percentage points.
Now, if you are an everyday citizen or an investor listening to this, 2 percentage points might sound like, I don't know, a rounding error.
Right, sounds small.
But compounded over a decade, that completely warps your financial reality. It is the difference between a booming, unstoppable economy and one that is just barely treading water.
The mechanism behind this overstatement is absolutely fascinating, and it comes down to how we actually collect data. Our national accounts increasingly rely on data from the formal, organized sector. But the vast majority of workers in India are in the informal sector.
Let me just play devil's advocate and push back on this for a second.
Sure.
If an unrecorded, cash-only neighborhood kirana shop closes down, and it gets replaced by a massive corporate retail chain that pays taxes, provides digital receipts, and is perfectly measurable.
Right.
Well, isn't that just an economy modernizing? Why wouldn't we call that real growth?
That is formalization, yes, but we cannot confuse formalization with broad-based economic progress. When that kirana shop closes, a local family's livelihood basically evaporates.
Right.
The corporate chain absorbs the neighborhood's market share. Statistically, the national accounts look at the corporate filings and record this shift as efficiency and a boost in GDP.
I see.
But the lived reality on the ground is that wealth is simply concentrating into a smaller, financialized elite, while the safety net for those displaced informal workers completely disintegrates.
And that informal sector has taken an absolute beating over the last decade. The data points to sequential shocks. You had demonetization in 2016, the complex rollout of GST, and of course the devastating impact of COVID-19.
Exactly.
All of these disproportionately destroyed informal cash-based trade. But because our GDP data is wearing blinders that only let it see the formal sector, that massive wave of human distress just entirely vanishes from the official statistics.
It creates a terrifying illusion. The headline GDP rises while economic insecurity spreads rapidly beneath it. And the institutional response to this has been deeply concerning.
Enough so.
Well, when the raw data contradicts the grand optimistic narrative, the data often gets quietly suppressed. We've seen an endlessly delayed census, the withholding of the 2017 to 2018 consumption survey because it showed declining household spending and constant friction over unemployment statistics.
That's just dangerous.
Highly dangerous. In any democracy, statistics are not just decorative talking points. They are the crucial public infrastructure we rely on to detect a crisis before it explodes.
And, moving to our Ground Zero report, when a government optimizes its data entirely for the formal economy, it inevitably starts designing its cities for that formal economy too.
Often literally bulldozing the informal reality in the process.
Exactly. And we are seeing this exact clash play out right now in Hyderabad. Let's dive into the Musi Riverfront development project.
It is a masterclass in the friction between top-down, aesthetic urban planning and fundamental citizen rights.
Set the scene for us.
So the state government looks at the Musi River, which is currently a seasonal river suffocating under sewage, and they envision a world-class perennial riverfront. They want a promenade modeled after the Thames in London or Cheonggyecheon in Seoul.
Which, on a billboard or a press release sounds glorious.
Sure does.
But then you zoom in on the human scale.
Mm-hmm.
You meet Thulasi Chandu, a journalist living in a residential complex called Madhu Park Ridge. From her balcony, she looks out at the Musi rivulet, and it is a nightmare. It is a dark stream of sewage. The stench is unbearable. The mosquitoes are relentless.
Yeah.
You would think she'd be thrilled about a cleanup.
Right, you would assume that.
But she is fighting the government tooth and nail because they are trying to displace her for this exact beautification project.
Yeah, to build this grand vision, the government needs to acquire massive amounts of land along the riverbanks. The Phase 1 cost alone is estimated at 6,500 to 7,000 crore rupees and includes plans for a 123-feet Gandhi statue. They are actively applying a strict 50-meter buffer zone rule to clear the area.
I really want to stop and look at the mechanics of this buffer zone because it creates a massive legal paradox. Thulasi's building and thousands of others were legally permitted and constructed around 2004.
Yes, fully legal at the time.
Citizens bought these homes legally, registered them, and paid property taxes on them for 20 years. But the government is now retroactively applying a buffer zone rule that was created in 2012 to declare these decades-old buildings illegal.
It's mind-boggling.
How does a state issue legal permits, take your tax money for 2 decades, and then suddenly shift the goalposts to treat you like a squatter?
It is a legal labyrinth that just destroys trust in civic institutions. And the displacement gets even worse when you look at how the government is handling compensation. The state is heavily cash-strapped.
So what are they offering?
Instead of offering direct, clear monetary payouts to these residents, they are pushing something called transferable development rights, or TDRs.
Explain how a TDR actually works, because on paper it sounds like a benefit, but in practice, reading this article, it sounds like a financial trap.
A TDR is essentially a piece of paper, a certificate, that grants the holder the right to build additional floor space somewhere else in the city.
Okay, so you don't get cash, you get a coupon to build elsewhere.
Exactly. The idea is that you can sell this certificate to a real estate developer who wants to build a taller high-rise. But think about who is actually receiving these. If you are an 80-year-old pensioner, or if you are Lovelina, a single mother featured in the report who is drowning under a massive 1.02 crore rupee bank loan for her current duplex, a TDR certificate does not pay your immediate mortgage.
Oh man, that is brutal.
It forces everyday citizens to become speculative traders in the real estate market just to recover the value of their stolen homes.
The chief minister even made a public remark suggesting the value of these apartments in the buffer zone will plummet to zero, which just absolutely terrifies these residents into submission.
It's a pressure tactic.
And if you step back and look at the environmental science of the project, it falls apart just as quickly. Environmentalists like Dante Narasimha Reddy, who is quoted in the piece, point out that 90% of what flows through the Musi is toxic sewage and industrial pharmaceutical waste.
You cannot solve a toxic waste crisis by just dredging sludge and pouring concrete promenades over it. Genuine ecological restoration means treating the entire river basin, replanting native vegetation, and aggressively stopping pharmaceutical effluents at their actual source.
Right, you have to fix the plumbing, not just paint the walls.
Exactly. Critics are loudly arguing that this isn't ecological revival at all. It is a massive real estate play masquerading as environmentalism.
It really seems like displacement optimized for aesthetics. But bulldozers and buffer zones aren't the only engines of displacement we are seeing today.
No, they certainly aren't.
If we step out of the city and into the agricultural heartland in our first spotlight piece, we see a massive economic displacement happening right now in Haryana, driven by the collapse of a technological miracle.
We are looking at the cotton farmers in Haryana who are drowning in a severe multi-year crisis. For a very long time, cotton was the ultimate cash crop. They called it white gold.
White gold?
Yeah. Today, it has become a financial sinkhole, and the primary culprit is a pest called the pink bollworm.
The human toll here is just brutal. The report introduces us to farmers like Satyavan and Dayanand Daka in Hisar. Dayanand says he managed to harvest just 3 to 4 quintals of cotton per acre last year, which left him deep in the red.
And that's not an isolated case.
No, a detailed report from the CCS-HAU Haryana's leading agricultural university calculated the farmers faced an average per acre loss of over 15,143 rupees in the last season alone.
To understand the sheer scale of this failure, we have to look back at the early 2000s when genetically modified Brait cotton was introduced. It was engineered with specific genes to fight off these exact pests.
And it worked at first, right?
At first, it was an absolute miracle. Farmers were seeing yields of 10 to 12 quintals per acre. But biology is relentless. It always adapts. By the early 2010s, the pink bollworm had developed resistance to the genetic modification. The technology failed, and the farmers were left holding the bag.
It traps these farmers on what I call the agricultural treadmill.
That's a great way to put it.
Because the baseline technology is failing, they are forced to run faster and faster just to stay in the exact same place. They have to borrow more money to buy more expensive seeds, burn more diesel, and dump more chemical fertilizers onto the soil until they finally collapse from the debt.
And when a farmer collapses financially, they have to pivot to survive. Because the cotton's being decimated, farmers in districts like Sirsa are mass shifting their fields to paddy, which is rice cultivation. The data shows rice cultivation in Sirsa jumped an astonishing 55% in just 4 years.
But wait, Sirsa has a dry climate and sandy loam soil. Rice is a notoriously massive water guzzler. Doesn't this completely sabotage the local ecology?
It drains the groundwater at a terrifying rate. It entirely undermines the government's own conservation scheme, the Maripani Mary Virasat scheme, which literally pays farmers to grow water-wise crops instead of paddy to save the water table.
So the policy is just failing.
The economic reality on the ground overrides the policy. The small government incentive is nowhere near enough to offset the total devastation of losing an entire cotton crop to the bollworm.
And the fallout from this pivot is crushing the most vulnerable people in the village. The report features Ishwar, a Delhi farm laborer, and Burmati, a woman who depends heavily on the seasonal income she makes from cotton picking.
Yes, the labor shift is huge here.
Harvesting cotton requires intense manual labor, which means it provides jobs. Harvesting paddy is almost entirely mechanized. When the wealthy landowners switch from cotton to rice, these local laborers are instantly rendered obsolete, forcing them into desperate migration to cities for grueling construction work.
It represents a cascading systemic failure. The genetic technology failed the crop, the agricultural market failed the farmer, and the resulting desperate pivot to rice is actively failing both the local labor force and the deep groundwater reserves.
We are seeing this relentless pattern of macro systems squeezing the working class. If we move to our second spotlight article, shifting from the physical health of the crops to the physical health of the citizens themselves, we see the exact same squeeze.
Yes, we are looking at the corporatization of the famous Kerala model of healthcare.
Historically, the Kerala model is studied globally. It achieved incredibly high life expectancy and low infant mortality by relying on highly accessible, affordable local care and strong public health awareness. But that entire landscape is currently being swallowed by a massive influx of global equity firms.
The story of Sunil Jose in the article perfectly captures the shock of this transition. He takes his daughter to a newly corporatized hospital for a basic routine fever. Before he knows what's happening, they hand him a quote for 10,000 rupees for a massive battery of diagnostic tests.
10,000 rupees for a fever.
Exactly. He literally grabbed his daughter, fled the hospital, went down the street to a local cooperative clinic, and paid just 1,000 rupees for the care she actually needed.
That 9,000 rupee difference is the invisible tax of corporatization. Massive global equity firms like KKR and Blackstone are pumping billions into aggressively buying up local hospitals across Kerala.
They are transforming what used to be community disease care into a hyper-financialized industry.
And the data is stark. The National Health Accounts report reveals that private per capita health expenditure in Kerala has nearly doubled, jumping from around 7,636 rupees to over 13,343 rupees. At the same time, over 3,306 small outpatient clinics and 444 inpatient institutions have shut their doors in the last 5 years.
And the mechanism driving those closures is fascinating. It's largely due to the Clinical Establishments Act. This act introduced incredibly strict new compliance rules and infrastructure standards.
Which sounds good on paper, right? Better standards.
While designed to ensure quality, the practical result is that a small neighborhood doctor suddenly has to buy wildly expensive new equipment they simply cannot afford, forcing them into bankruptcy. The beloved concept of the accessible local family doctor is being systematically legislated out of existence.
Now, the corporate hospital executives, like BMH's CEO Harish Manian, defend this aggressively. He argues this isn't greedy commercialization. He says it is necessary adaptation.
Right. He claims costs are only rising because patients demand advanced diagnostics and better infrastructure.
He draws a hard line between cost inflation, which he says is just paying for better tech, and price escalation, which would be gouging. I have to challenge that completely.
Oh, absolutely.
Is the difference between cost inflation and price escalation just slick corporate jargon? Background research from the articles explicitly details how these corporate hospitals operate. They hire specialist doctors on massive salaries, but those salaries come with strict revenue-linked targets.
Yes, the quotas.
Doctors have daily quotas for admissions and diagnostic tests. If a terrified patient is manipulated into paying for a barrage of unnecessary MRI scans just so a physician can hit their monthly corporate quota, I don't care what sophisticated economic term the CEO applies to it. It is pure financial extraction.
You've hit on the fundamental conflict of interest. When a hospital's ultimate backing comes from global private equity, their highest fiduciary duty is to the shareholders' return on investment, not the most cost-effective public health outcome for the patient.
Right.
It fundamentally corrupts the doctor-patient trust. And worse, it forces the remaining mid-sized hospitals to take on massive debt to buy similar fancy equipment just to compete for patients, which drives the baseline cost of care through the roof across the entire state.
This exact same theme, privatization, creeping into essential public systems under the shiny guise of modernization, is playing out in the public transport sector as well in our final spotlight piece.
Yes, we are looking at the deep anxiety gripping the 40,000 workers of the Andhra Pradesh State Road Transport Corporation, the APSRTC, over the rapid shift to electric buses.
Now, everyone agrees that transitioning to electric mobility is vital for the environment.
Sure.
But the APSRTC is executing this transition using a gross cost contract, or GCC, model.
Electric buses are incredibly expensive to buy and maintain. So instead of the government purchasing the buses and training their own staff to use them, they are hiring private operators like Pinnacle Mobility Solutions to supply and run the fleets.
I want to use an analogy to make the GCC model crystal clear, because it sounds bureaucratic, but the impact is brutal. It's like a commercial airline deciding to upgrade its entire fleet to brand new, fuel-efficient jets. But instead of training their veteran pilots to fly the new planes, the airline just leases the jets from a private company that insists on bringing their own pilots. The airline's loyal 20-year veteran pilots are left standing on the tarmac, staring at the new planes, wondering if they still have a job.
That is exactly what is happening at the depots, specifically at places like the Vidyadharapuram depot in Vijayawada. Take Ampavali Ramesh, a veteran driver with 18 years of loyal service. He has kids in college, he has a housing loan to pay off.
Real stakes.
Very real. He is watching the government induct 875 new e-buses under the PM e-bus SOA scheme, with plans for 1,450 more, all driven by private contractors. The unions are terrified. Even if the government promises no immediate mass layoffs, the workers know this means stalled promotions, fewer available shifts, and a total freeze on hiring the next generation of public workers.
And what makes this situation so incredibly complex is that this worker anxiety is crashing headfirst into a massive surge in passenger demand. The government recently launched the Stree Shakti scheme, which provides completely free bus travel for women.
And from a passenger perspective, the scheme is a historic success. Women like P. Kamswari, who sells clothes door-to-door, and Metacharla Lakshmi, a widow building a small business, have stated on the record that this free travel is an absolute lifeline. It grants them mobility and economic independence they never had.
But the friction is unbearable. Because the APSRTC is relying on an aging fleet and is severely understaffed while waiting for the private e-buses, the buses that are running are dangerously overcrowded. Conductors like Y. Kusuma Kumari and A. Sitha Lakshmi are bearing the brunt of this.
They report that the physical stress is crushing them.
Right. There are no slack hours anymore. It is wall-to-wall peak crowding from dawn to dusk, leading to physical exhaustion and actual suffocation on the job. The workers are trapped in a vice. They are physically overwhelmed by the current demand, while simultaneously terrified of being replaced by the shiny new electric fleet.
It perfectly encapsulates the entire theme of our discussion today. The grand policy of green energy and free mobility looks phenomenal on a spreadsheet, but the actual lived reality on the ground is a workforce being pushed to the brink of collapse.
After exploring all this heavy friction between federal states, manipulated statistics, urban bulldozers, failing crops, corporate hospitals, and exhausted bus conductors, it's time to step off the concrete.
I think we all need a breather.
Yeah. For our final piece from the weekend section, we are looking at how humans are deliberately trying to slow down, step away from the noise, and reconnect with the natural world through the evolution of wildlife tourism.
The history of wildlife tourism in India is actually quite aggressive. It used to be defined by loud, diesel-chugging jeep safaris, with tourists rushing frantically through national parks, desperately hunting for a 2-second tiger sighting just to check it off a bucket list.
Like just a very consumptive way of interacting with nature.
Exactly. But we are seeing a profound shift towards slow, deeply guided educational experiences. Local naturalists are teaching visitors how to literally read the forest using their ears and noses, not just their camera lenses.
The contrasting examples in the article are just beautiful. At the ultra-high end, you have wildlife photographer Ismail Sharif running 11-day snow leopard expeditions in the freezing altitudes of Ladakh. These trips are not cheap. They cost upwards of 1.75 lakh rupees. The guides use massive Swarovski spotting scopes, and they have a strict ethical stance against using bait to lure the animals out.
And spotting a snow leopard in that vast, rocky terrain is notoriously difficult. They are perfectly camouflaged. They are known as the ghosts of the mountains for a reason.
Ismail says something in the interview that completely stopped me in my tracks. He says spotting a snow leopard is less about finding a cat and more about convincing your eyes that the mountain has quietly grown whiskers.
Oh, that is a beautiful way to put it.
I just love that imagery. Think about what that requires. In a modern world of instant gratification, where we demand our GDP growth right now, our fast electric buses right now, our corporate health test results right now, people are suddenly willing to pay a premium to stand in the freezing cold for 11 days just hoping a mountain grows whiskers. Why is the thrill of the wait so deeply powerful?
Because the wait demands true presence. It forces you to actually inhabit the environment and respect its rhythm, rather than just blindly consuming it. And we are seeing this ethos at the grassroots level, too. In Assam, a local village headman named Joypan Kemprai takes visitors for free, guiding them through dense bamboo thickets to observe endangered freshwater turtles at Hajong Lake.
For free?
Yes, he uses the long periods of waiting to teach the visitors about the intricate ecology of the bamboo itself.
We see it in Arunachal Pradesh as well, with Nilpal Mahanta. He takes students on grueling 8-kilometer treks, but not to chase the famous Indian rhinos. He stops them to touch the rocks, to look closely at bryophytes, primitive microscopic plants that slowly break down solid rock to form the very soil the forest grows in. We are also seeing people like Kushik Chattopadhyay forming ethical photography groups. There is a profound ethical stance developing here. It's a complete rejection of baiting animals or building artificial photography hides. It is about deeply respecting the invisible systems that keep the ecosystem alive.
And if we bring this entire deep dive full circle, what that naturalist does in the silent forest is exactly what we need to do as citizens looking at our national narratives.
How do you mean?
Well, the naturalist looks right past the obvious loud tiger on the safari path and forces you to pay attention to the soil, the bamboo, and the hidden systems holding it all together. Whether we are talking about the hidden economic realities of the southern states, the uncounted Kirana shops erased from the GDP data, the displaced urban residents fighting a buffer zone, the struggling cotton farmers trapped on a treadmill, or the elusive snow leopard, the fundamental truth is almost never in the loud headline. It requires slow, careful, empathetic observation of the ground reality.
That is brilliantly said. So I want to leave you, our listener, with a question to mull over. Take a long look at your own community this weekend. Think about the people working around you. What is the informal reality happening right under the surface of your city that the grand official narrative is completely ignoring? What is the real story quietly hiding behind the headline? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.